Okay, magandang hapon sa lahat. Siguro pwede kayong mag-move forward na para ma-occupy natin yung harap. Come on, come on. So we can start. Maybe we can start in 3 minutes. We're expecting more than 100 students. That's the expectation. Okay, magandang hapon sa lahat. Ayaw niyo talaga sa harap, no? Nahihiya. Sige. Malamig ba? Sige. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming here this afternoon to listen to a prominent scholar of Southeast Asian history and politics. No, the lecture this afternoon is co-organized by the UP Department of History and the UP Third World Studies Center. Okay, so the lecture is titled "Why the 19th Century Deserves a Second Reading: Colonial Writings About Southeast Asia as Confessional Texts." So let me introduce to you our speaker this afternoon. Farish A. Noor is Professor of Politics and Political Science at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the International Islamic University of Indonesia, the Universidad Islam Internacional Indonesia. He was formerly attached to the Centro Moderner Orient in Berlin, Germany, and the International Institute for the Study of the Muslim World at Leiden, the Netherlands. And then the S. Raja Ratman School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He was also visiting academic at several European colleges and universities, including Sciences Po Paris and the Institute for the Study of Muslim Society, also in Paris. He recently served as a professor at the Department of History, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, University of Malaya. He is a senior fellow at the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and currently a distinguished visiting professor at the De La Salle University here in Manila. Professor Noor's main area of research and writing is colonial Southeast Asia in the 19th century, with a particular focus on the workings of the discourse of racialized colonial capitalism. He brought with him today his most recent works. Apat yung dala niyang libro. Apat lang naman. 4 books. All, all on Southeast Asia and 19th century Southeast Asia. Okay. His fields of study include conflict processes, international relations, cultural history, philosophy, history, and discourse analysis. His areas of expertise encompass Southeast Asian history, Asian studies, and 19th century history. So without further ado, let's give the floor to Professor Farish A. Noor.
Thank you so much, Jelly, and thank you to the organizers and hosts for this event. I'm very happy to be here to see all of you and talk to you today about a subject that's actually very close to my heart, which happens to be Southeast Asia. Now, the title that I chose is somewhat enigmatic, and I suppose in order to explain the title, I need to tell you a bit about myself and my academic background. Jelly earlier mentioned that I'm a historian of Southeast Asia. I'm a political historian of Southeast Asia. However, I'm actually a mongrel. I'm a hybrid, because in terms of my disciplinary background, I'm not actually trained as a historian. My background is actually philosophy. My first degree was in philosophy and literature, followed by a master's in philosophy, and then a second master's in Southeast Asian studies, and only much later then into politics and governance. And my real early interests were in philosophy and philosophy of language in particular. Over the last 20 years, 15 or 20 years, I've gone back to my original domain, which is Southeast Asian history. And what I've tried to do is write a critical account of the 19th century and how colonial capitalism not only came to Southeast Asia, but invented Southeast Asia, created Southeast Asia. The very Southeast Asia that we reside in today is a colonial construct. If you don't believe me, look at any map of Southeast Asia. That's a colonial map. That's a colonial map, because all the borders of Southeast Asia that we have today were not decided by Southeast Asians. Our map was drawn not here. Our map was drawn in Madrid, in London, in Paris, in The Hague, and what have you. So the reason why I find this important and relevant to all of us is that we live today in this modern world, which, whether we like it or not, has been shaped and determined by historical processes. And part of the history of Southeast Asia, obviously, is the history of empire and colonialism. We cannot have any discussion on Southeast Asia without talking about the legacy of empire. And we cannot talk about the legacy of empire without talking about the role of capital and capitalism, right? So in that sense, all of us are modern subjects. We are products of a modernity that we did not initiate, perhaps, or we did not, determine, but it has determined us. So thank you for alluding to my books earlier. I promise you I'm not a bookseller. I'm not here to sell my books. But the thing about my books, what I've been doing over the last decade or so is that, as I said, I've been writing a history of Southeast Asia, but it's not the sort of history of Southeast Asia that many of us might be familiar with. Now, the history of Southeast Asia, of course, has been studied at length in great detail by a lot of good scholars, both Asian and Western scholars. And there's no reason for me to repeat that and to write another history of Southeast Asia. But as I said, my background is in philosophy and linguistics and philosophy of language. And so what I've done really is write books about books. Yeah. My account of the history of Southeast Asia draws heavily upon the language and the discourses that came into circulation and were very much in currency in the 19th century, and how these discourses created new epistemic and new geographical realities that we live with today. And so what I want to talk about now today is why I think this was important. There's a simple question. I mean, why on earth would anyone read the writings of some dead colonial functionary who met his end 200 years ago? These are I mean, if you want to be blunt about it, these are books by dead white men, right? So what's the point? Why read something that is long gone and long past? There are many typical responses to that question. An immediate response that many people come up with would be, well, first thing, so what? Empires did. It's over. Right? Writing a critical history of empire doesn't erase empire. Another one would be, well, these people are dead and gone anyway, and their ideas died with them. So nobody talks like that, nobody writes like that anymore today. So what possible relevance can they be in trying to understand or excavate these writings that were produced 200 years ago? In a sense, these reactions are typical, but they're also superficial at the surface, because yes, of course, nobody denies the fact that these authors are dead. However, the circumstances of their writing, the circumstances of their work, the structure, that sustained this kind of narrative production, remains today in many forms. And what I constantly emphasize in my own work and in my teaching is that we need to avoid this tendency to think of history in episodic terms. This is a common thing that we do. We even use it in terms of the way we label our disciplines and we demarcate our disciplines. We talk about a pre-colonial past, a colonial past, and a post-colonial present. That episodic understanding of history divides history into neat chunks, like episodes of Game of Thrones or whatever. But it doesn't work that way, because there are no episodic barriers in time. And the pre-colonial informs the colonial, and the colonial informs the post-colonial, and vice versa, because time influences ideas. These things, they flow back and forth, they cross-fertilize and they overlap. But for me, there's another important aspect that perhaps many of us have neglected. Yeah. Basically, I'm trying to use this lecture to explain to you what really motivated me to adopt this approach to trying to understand how colonialism and imperialism were normalized through language. Yeah. And the reasons for this, although they pertain to the historical past, I would argue are immediately relevant for us today. Because if you were to distill the realities of colonialism and imperialism, and then basically we're talking about oppression and power and domination always requires a discourse of justification, right? No empire ever does what it does without some means of justification. And this reminds us of the fact that when we talk about empire and colonialism, the legacy of empire and the legacy of colonialism, there's a huge chunk that is missing in our understanding of empire. And that is the fact that empire requires normality. It requires normalization. A cursory overview, yeah, a quick glance at how we in post-colonial Southeast Asia understand colonialism. I mean, just go to your Netflix, I mean, don't do it now, but, go to your Netflix later on and watch the kind of movies that we produce, yeah, about the colonial era. I mean, the Philippines does that, Indonesia does that, Malaysia does that. And some of these movies become huge hits, yeah. We still have this tendency to think of colonialism and empire mainly in terms of force and violence. Yeah. There's always this emphasis on force and violence. So in the popular imaginary, when we talk about empire, we think of battles and wars, battles and wars, battles and wars. I'm not obviously denying that there were battles and wars. There's a huge human cost, yeah, to that. However, a recurring argument that I've made is that when we talk about modern colonialism, and this for me begins with modern capital from the 17th century onwards. Modern colonial capitalism, because it's driven by capital and it has as its motive profit, sees wars as counterproductive, wasteful, right? And so the imperative is to normalize colonialism as fast as possible. And the routine aspect of daily colonial life is something that we in post-colonial Southeast Asia have failed to understand and analyze and discuss at length. I mean, people, of course, talk about, the colonial battles and the evil colonial soldiers and what have you, but the running of colonies, the management of colonies was done not by soldiers. They were done by postmen. They were done by statisticians. It was done by cartographers. It was done by civil servants, bureaucrats. And that's modernity. Yeah. This is, the argument you get from Bauman, modernity and the Holocaust. The Holocaust, horrific though it was a bureaucratic affair. The overriding discipline was management. You manage slaughter, you manage conquest, you manage colonization. And so as I read these books that were produced in the 19th century, what I find in them is a concerted and sustained attempt on the part of the primary actors of colonization themselves, yeah, to find some means to render colonization normal. Because, of course, at the heart of it, colonization itself is something deeply unnatural. It is the forced possession of the territory, of the homeland of others. And that's an unnatural situation. And that unnatural situation has to be made natural somehow. And so the amazing thing about empire is that empire then becomes a narrative factory. Empires produce stories that they tell themselves. Empires need stories to tell themselves so that empire can go to sleep at night. Empire needs to assuage its own conscience. So these books of mine are basically books about books, where what I do is I look at the history, the experience of Western colonialism in Southeast Asia in the 19th century, but through the lens of colonial writers, most of whom were colonial functionaries. These were not tourists, yeah, who came to Southeast Asia. They were directly implicated. They were directly involved in the process of colony making and empire building, but how, in the process of doing so, a number of narratives were actually at work. And then when we begin to see that, we begin to see that actually empire building is not simply a case, it's not caveman politics. You don't go around with a club, you knock someone on the head, you take their land. No, it's a complicated process. It requires multiple layers of narratives to be able to build up a story that somehow is coherent and makes sense, and that meets the criteria of a certain register, an epistemic register, a moral register, a logical register, that somehow allows this thing to then come alive. So in the first book, The Discursive Construction of Southeast Asia in 19th Century Colonial Capitalist Discourse, I look at a number of British authors who begin to encounter this thing, which eventually comes to be called Southeast Asia. During the 19th century, all these competing empires, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, come to our part of the world. They find a thing. The thing has not been named, but they know they've chanced upon something. Discovering Southeast Asia then becomes a process of inventing Southeast Asia. And in the interesting observation that I found is that none of these authors, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, could agree on what Southeast Asia was. Some of these books have become landmark texts. They're even found in curricula of Southeast Asia area studies departments abroad, in Europe, in America, and what have you. Take a work like Stamford Raffles' History of Java, published in 1817. Raffles has an understanding of what Southeast Asia is. And for Raffles, Southeast Asia is another Egypt. It's another India. That's how Raffles sees Java and Southeast Asia by extension. It is a land of great antiquity. So Southeast Asian suddenly becomes this other Egypt in the tropics. It is another India in the tropics. It is a land of great antiquity, where the people of Southeast Asia have achieved extraordinary things, but in the past. Yeah. And if we were to study how this narrative works, it's actually a very interesting trope that's being devised here. There is a deliberate and sustained attempt to create the idea of Southeast Asia as a place of great historical importance. Raffles' point that the antiquities of Java deserve to be brought to London and placed right next to Egyptian civilization and Indian civilization. That's how incredibly refined we are, apparently. But the key word here is past. Yeah, they were great once. They were great once. And so automatically, by default, something happens. Southeast Asia's greatness is placed in the past. And the term, the degenerate Javanese, comes into play. Yeah. Degenerate in the historical sense. The Javanese were great, but they have now degenerated into the past. And so it is the duty of the West, of Britain in particular, that has now inherited the mantle of the Enlightenment and progress and modernity. It is the duty of Britain not only to colonize Java, of course, but to preserve Java as a museum. And this museumization of Java, the museumization of Southeast Asia, becomes then, a theme not only in Raffles, but in French authors like Delaport, who say that Cambodia is the same. Cambodia was great once, but has to be preserved. And it needs a modern, present civilizational power to do that. And that power happens to be Britain or France, right? So that's one understanding of Southeast Asia. But then when you read someone like John Crawford writing about Burmans and the Burmese, now for Crawford, Burmese are all psychopaths and mass murderers who cannot be trusted because they are the deadliest enemies of the British Empire. So then we have another Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia becomes a land of danger. It becomes a hostile space. And it is hostile not only to British interests, but it is hostile to itself too. And then we go back and we fall back on all these familiar tropes of native despotism, native misrule, native anarchy, and what have you. And then why is the West here? Well, the West here is here to restore order, to bring order to a place that cannot order itself. The West then becomes an ordering principle that is brought to a state of almost natural disorder and chaos. And that's another Southeast Asia altogether. And so as we put these narratives together, we see bit by bit, Southeast Asia comes together like a jigsaw puzzle. Although the pieces are actually not related to one another, eventually they form this idea of Southeast Asia. While writing this book, I was going through all the manuscripts I had in my collection, and they were American authors as well. And then I realized, initially my plan was to compare British and American authors, but then I realized after a while that American authors actually had a very different way of approaching Southeast Asia. And that led me to my second book, America's Encounters, which is also a book about books, and how American authors had, interestingly, initially attempted to resist this Oriental gaze, this Orientalizing gaze. And this is, in keeping with America's early genesis and perhaps the first few decades of its political innocence. We all, of course, in Southeast Asia know and are familiar with and have felt the imprint of America in our part of the world. Many of us, however, forget that at the very beginning of the 19th century, when Americans first began to come to Southeast Asia, this wasn't an America, this was a United States that, after freeing itself from the grip of Britain, unilaterally disbanded its own navy. There was a time when America did not even have a navy because it wanted to project an image of itself that was different, that America is not an imperial power. It is not a conquering power. We are Western, but we are not them. We are Western, but we are not them. And so we are not going to have a navy. We are not going to go around bombing countries and conquering countries. We're not going to do any of that. And so when the Americans first come to Southeast Asia, they come with the intention of trade, and they build their own narratives. American scholarship on Southeast Asia is interesting because up to the 18th century, Americans' knowledge of Southeast Asia was derived entirely from European sources, mainly British sources, English sources. So Americans now say, okay, we don't need you anymore. We are going to discover Southeast Asia on our own. And we're going to write our own story of Southeast Asia. And so what's the story that they write? And this in itself is another interesting story. It's an interesting story because it tells us the story of how America comes to embrace empire. And America's inevitable embrace of empire, ironically, is the result of America's encounters with Southeast Asia. Yeah. Because when Americans first come to Southeast Asia, they find that Southeast Asia has already been, blocked by all the colonial powers that are here. America comes as a young country, a young republic. It's trying to seek alliances and to find safe ports to trade because it doesn't want to rely on European trade. It wants to trade directly with Southeast Asians. But as it tries to do that, it finds that practically every rich part of Southeast Asia already has a European presence. The British are here, the French are there, the Spanish are here, the Portuguese are there. So the Americans seek new allies. Their first treaty is actually with Siam, Thailand, and the second treaty is with Brunei. But in time, as America comes to trade in Southeast Asia, it comes to realize, actually, we can get rich here. We can get rich here. And the key event, one hugely important historical event, which impacts on all of us in this room, is actually the American-Mexican War. And the defeat of Mexico means that America gains California. And by gaining California, America becomes a Pacific power. After that, we see a shift in the way Americans conceive of Southeast Asia. That accessibility, the ease with which Americans begin to come more and more frequently to Southeast Asia, turns Southeast Asia from a trading partner to a prize. And likewise, in the narratives of these American authors, we see a change in perception and the way in which Southeast Asia is conceived. Southeast Asia eventually is conceived as a den of pirates. It's a threat to American commerce. And because it's a threat to American commerce, America must be here to protect international commerce. All these are stories. They're all stories. And the point about stories is that they don't have to be factually correct. Yeah. The point about stories is that they don't have to be factually correct, but they have to be coherent. They have to make sense. They have to have meaning, and they do. And who do they have meaning for? They have meaning for the intended readership. So what have I been doing then, by looking at these narrative accounts of Southeast Asia in the 19th century? How is this a history of Southeast Asia? It is a history of Southeast Asia, but it's also more than a history of Southeast Asia. And that's what I wanted to turn to next. What are these books? Yeah. What are these books? 19th century texts, of course, are dated by today's standards. Nobody writes like this today, when you read these 19th century texts, I mean, from the outset, from page one, I mean, you're struck by things which jar with us as modern contemporary readers today. I mean, apart from the exceedingly long titles, a title with 50 words, which was the norm in the 19th century. You're not a serious writer unless your title is half the page. Apart from that, is the way in which these books are written for a specific readership. Yeah. These are works that were written during the age of empire. And the age of empire, we need to remind ourselves, is the age of intense contestation and competition in the West. Yeah. In fact, one could argue that what propels the West to the East is the conflict in the West itself. I mean, why does Britain take the path of empire? Why does Holland take the path of empire? Why does France take the path of empire? It's because the moment Spain builds an empire in the Americas, every country in Europe is scared, because you cannot allow Spain to become the richest country in Europe. It's a threat to the rest of us. So if Spain has an empire, Holland has to have an empire. Britain has to have an empire. France has to have an empire. This is primarily a turf war going on in Europe. The European turf war becomes globalized and ends up becoming the age of modern imperialism. So all of us, in Asia and Africa, are drawn into what is basically a European war. And this European war becomes a global war. So in a sense, you can backdate the First World War to the 17th century. Yeah. Now, if you take that as the premise, then these works that were produced in the 19th century were also part of a discursive turf war between competing nations. When Raffles writes the history of Java, I think it's safe to assume that he's not writing for the Javanese. Yeah? Couldn't care less about the Javanese. He's writing the history of Java, the history of the land of Java and the people of Java, not for the Javanese, but for his fellow Englishmen. When Crawford writes his account of the mission to Burma, he's not writing it for the Burmese to read. He's writing it for his fellow Englishmen back in England to read. And that's the interesting thing about these texts. Yeah. They're not written for us. None of these books were written for us. None of the British accounts, none of the French accounts, none of the Dutch accounts, none of the American accounts of Southeast Asia were ever written for Southeast Asians. We are not the intended audience. And in fact, you can go further. You can even say that, for someone like Raffles 200 years ago, he would never have imagined that one day a post-colonial third world scholar like me would actually be reading his work, because that's beyond the horizon of possibility for him, I mean, God forbid, I mean, if one of these natives actually reads this stuff, what will they think of me? Well, that's what's happening now. So what am I doing? I'm doing that. I'm doing that. I'm reading something that I'm not intended to read. And in the process of reading these books that I'm not meant to be reading, I'm discovering another way of reading them again. And in the process of discovering new ways of reading them, I'm discovering another way to understand our history of Southeast Asia. So you see, for me, and I think this is crucial, and this is where history and literature and literary analysis and critique come together. Yeah? They come together in this crucial point of overlap. The assumption held by many is that respectful reading, proper reading of anything, whether it's an orientalist text like the history of Java, or a novel like Sense and Sensibility, or even the menu at McDonald's, yeah, a proper reading requires us, the reader, to somehow to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the author and intuit correctly the intentionality of the author. That's nonsense. That's impossible. Yeah, I can't read Jane Austen the way Jane Austen wrote, because A, I'm not Jane Austen, and B, I'm a 21st century third world academic from the developing South. I can only read Jane Austen from the perspective of a third world academic from the developing South. And that's how I'm going to read Jane Austen. And that's how I'm going to read Raffles and Crawford and Mundy and Keppel and Reynolds and Warringer and all these other authors. Now, as I do that, something interesting happens. Something about the subject position of the reader allows us to see certain things which perhaps the intended readers of these authors did not or could not see. This is Edward Said's point, yeah, when he talks about colonial fiction and how colonial fiction has a different impact on different readerships. He talks about Rudyard Kipling's novel, Kim. And Said says, now, a novel like Kim, which is a work of British colonial imperial orientalist fiction, now that might resonate with a British colonial imperial readership in England. But an Indian reading Kim will read it differently. An Indian can only read it differently because the novel is about him, the colonial subject. When I read these works, questions of objectivity, do not come, to the fore for me. I'm not concerned whether the facts are correct. I'm not concerned whether, Crawford gets his figures right or Raffles gets his figures right. I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about what is being communicated and what I alluded to earlier, how they see Southeast Asia, how they frame Southeast Asia. So the authorship of these authors, come to the fore. So here's an example. There's one way that we can read Raffles' The History of Java, the conventional way it used to be taught in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. It's a book about Java, written by a colonial functionary, Stanford Raffles. It's got the history of Java, boring, 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 boring. It's got, ethnic studies of the Javanese, boring, 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 boring. And it's got its conclusions about the future of Java and what can be done with Java, boring, predictable, boring, predictable. Yep, okay, that's the conventional way of reading it. But once you stop trying to put yourself in Raffles' shoes, and you read the text for what it is, and you located it in its context, and you read it from your subject position, same text, what do we find in the text? Well, we find two things. The history of Java is not simply the history of Java, it's actually two stories. A close reading of the history of Java reveals it's actually about two things. One, it's actually not about Java, it's actually about the Dutch. Because littered throughout this 2-volume work are copious references to the Dutch and basically how nasty, useless, corrupt, and inefficient the Dutch are. Because remember, yeah, Britain occupies Java for 6 years. They take it from the Dutch. And so basically, what the history of Java is, it's a Dutch bashing text. And this is intended for his English readership back home. It's like, we Englishmen, we know how to run colonies. Look at these Dutch, they had it for 200 years. They can't do anything with it. So it's a long litany or record of Dutch mismanagement, Dutch corruption, Dutch abuse of power, how the Dutch, just don't know how to run things and what have you. That's one. Another parallel narrative is the one I mentioned earlier about not the Javanese, but rather, how important all these antiquities are, and perhaps we should actually museumize all of it. The two narratives go hand in hand. But what do these two narratives tell us? Do they tell us anything about the Javanese? Do we learn anything about Java from the history of Java? Not really. Do we learn anything about the Dutch from the history of Java? Not really. But what do we learn? We learn a lot about Raffles. We learn a lot about the author. And who is the author? The author is the Lieutenant Governor of the British colony of Java, who was appointed by the British East India Company. The history of Java is basically a company report. It's an intel report sent back to London so that a weaponized colonial company can plan the further colonial development of its new colony in the East Indies. So in that sense, that's what I mean when I call these texts confessional texts. The way in which Raffles sees Java, as a prize to be taken from the useless Dutch, all of this tells us about the geopolitics of Europe. So in the end, do we learn anything about Java? Not much, but we learn a lot about Europe. We learn a lot about Europe. We learn a lot about the geopolitics of Europe. We learn a lot about British-Dutch rivalry in Europe. We learn a lot about the machinations and the ambitions of the British East India Company in Southeast Asia. We learn a lot about the ego and vanity of Raffles, because Raffles is everywhere. He's like the academic Taylor Swift of his time. He's everywhere in this book. Even in the map that comes, his name is all over the map. I was here, I was here, I was here. And then, so you learn about this whole cult of the company warrior, colonizer, hero, which gets developed in this book. And in that sense, that reading is new. And that reading is original. Because I've never encountered any attempt to read these colonial texts from that perspective. Not to read meanings into the text, because I'm quoting directly from the text itself. These are their words. These are their words. They are the ones who say things like, no one knows more about Java than I do, Raffles, These are their words. And their words, in a sense, are confessional statements. They confess to the ambitions of empire, the workings of empire, the workings of modern colonialism at that time that require, this kind of discourse of legitimation that sustains the entire enterprise. And so in a sense, that's what I've been doing to all these books and in all the books that I've been writing over the last 15 years. And one might ask, how any of this, if in any way this contributes to our understanding of Southeast Asian studies. Well, I think it does. And it does so in a number of ways. Firstly, if we see these texts the way I have tried to present them to you, as multi-layered discourses that are multi-directional, that we can read them in different ways, The same text, is abundant with meaning if you know how to read it and read it properly, read it, literally in detail, then you also understand that all these works that were on Southeast Asia, and it doesn't just apply to Southeast Asia, by the way. Yeah, the 19th century was a period where thousands of books were written and published, not only about Southeast Asia, but East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa. You know, I mean, sometimes people joke, right? This proves that, you know, imperialism is good for publishing. Yeah, because when you have empires, you provide the opportunity structures for people to produce colonial knowledge. And it's an enormous amount of writing. Yeah. Literally dozens of books and monographs every year just on Southeast Asia. Now, if we set these books in their context and we read them critically today, what does this show? What it shows is that actually these binary dichotomies that we are used to, you know, West and East, Europe and Southeast Asia, they can actually be problematized. Like I said, the history of Java purports to be a book about the history of Java. But it is really a history of England. Because what the book tells us is how the English saw Java in the 19th century. Now, if we understand that, if we can internalize that, that changes the way we do everything from historical analysis to literary analysis. And that's hugely important for us as Southeast Asian scholars today. That's one. Two, reading these books as confessional texts doesn't mean that we dismiss all of them as lies. Yeah. Of course, a lot of it is propaganda. It's imperialist. What do you expect? Of course, it's propaganda, right? But even as propaganda, even as fictions, as Said, you know, coined the term instrumental fictions, just because something is fiction doesn't mean it's useless. I mean, fictions are very useful. And Said coins the term instrumental fictions. And these are instrumental fictions. The idea of, you know, the lazy Malay, the lazy Filipino, the violent Burmese, these are fictions, but they're powerful fictions. Wars can be fought on these fictions, right? Now, these fictions deserve to be interrogated. But these fictions also tell us something about how the fictional Southeast Asian other also framed the West. Yeah. Because if you are the constitutive other to the West, that relationship is an intimate one. Yeah. Southeast Asia is always present. It's always necessary because the West needs its other. That makes Southeast Asia an intimate component of what the West is. So if we study Southeast Asian history, if we study Southeast Asian identity, if we do Southeast Asian studies in any sense, where do we locate Southeast Asia? Yeah. To the southeast of something? Or are we not actually intimately bound at the very core of these universal identities that the West talk about? Now, if that's the case, then it leads me to my third point. Then Southeast Asian history is not Southeast. It's not a parochial history. Southeast Asian history is necessarily part of global history because it's part of this hegemonic global discourse that we have today, which emanates from the West. But like I said, the West was never sui generis. It never emerges, you know, miraculously out of nothing. It has always required the other to become part of what it is. And you're bound to that. You're part of that process. You're already in it from the beginning. That locates our history as part of world history. And that's how we, I believe, have to understand Southeast Asian history. I really don't like the way some Southeast Asians continue to parochialize us and exoticize us, because that means that, you know, we are perpetually doomed to always be located in the other section of the library or the bookshop. You know, it's like when you go to bookshops in the West, you know, you have literature, and then you have Asian literature in the corner, you know, or you have philosophy, and then you have Asian philosophy in the corner, normally one shelf, right? But that's dangerous for us. But that happens when we buy into this narrative of our Southeast Asianness, our particularity, our parochialism. We are not, because Empire actually brought us into the center, and we actually are part of empire in ways which we may like or not like, agree or not agree. Like it or not, you're stuck, you're in it. We are part of global history. Now, if this is the case, then finally, what's our role as the Southeast Asian scholar today? Well, the Southeast Asian scholar today, as far as I'm concerned, has to be and should be a global scholar. Because that's what we do. We do history. What am I doing? Am I writing this history of Southeast Asia? Yes. But I'm not just writing the history of Southeast Asia. I'm writing the history of the West. I'm writing a critical history of the West in the way that the West attempts to identify itself, know itself, locate itself in relation to the Southeast Asia as its constitutive other. If that's the case, then any critical reading of that is a critique of the West. And surely it has to be time when we in Southeast Asia, also begin to write and to think and to research beyond our borders. I mean, in the wake of decolonization in the first decades, after independence, I do understand this enthusiastic rush, of the first generation of national historians. We've won back our state. There's been state capture. We've got back our countries. And so we want to write our national histories. And we want to right all these national wrongs all over again. Okay, fine, I understand that. But 50, 60, 70 years on, are we still going to write national histories and only national histories? And when are we going to realize that our national histories are regional histories and our regional histories are actually world histories? Are we going to continually parochialize ourselves in some quiet corner of history as a discipline, or philosophy as a discipline, or literature as a field all the time because we've been allocated a space which is your space, which is, the poison chalice, the poison gift of empire. This is your space. You are Southeast Asians. You can do what your Southeast Asian, people do. You do your local stuff, but leave the global universals to us. Now, sorry, I don't accept that. I do not accept that. I will not accept that because I think it is the duty and the responsibility of the third world historian to not only historicize about it and analyze the present condition of, the so-called South, but to also explain how the South was made South, how the third world was made the third world. And this means writing these critical histories of the manner in which our identities were constructed and politicized, and our subject positions were actually given to us and fixed, and where we are located in time. And so what I hope I've been able to do is more than just simply, be a historian of Southeast Asia. What I've tried to do by taking this multidisciplinary approach is to problematize, A, how we understand history and how we write history, B, to show that we can't talk simply, and history is not simply about numbers and dates and names and places. History is also about narratives and discourses and the power of language, and that language is power. 3, I've tried to show that through this kind of critical textual analysis, we demonstrate that, Western accounts of the East are as much about the West as they are about the East, and this intimately binds us together in a sort of maybe not so happy marriage, but nonetheless a marriage with no divorce options here, where, like it or not, our identities are intertwined, and so we need to be engaged with one another. But it does open up, this does for us, for future research, for future academic endeavor. It doesn't mean, and I hope, that this might appeal, particularly to young scholars today, to think beyond, playing the role of the native informer, constantly just writing about our part of the world, about just our country, about just our traditions, just about our culture, our language, and what have you. Because if that is all that we do, and if that is all that we can do, in the post-colonial era, then in so many ways, the post-colonial historian, the post-colonial scholar becomes not that very much different from the native informer of the colonial era. The West, for me, is too important to be left to the West. And so in the process of writing a critical history of Southeast Asia, what I've tried to do is also write a critical history of the West in Southeast Asia. And this might have created, I think, a kind of hybrid product in the end. But I think this kind of hybridity is also something that, is worth developing further, and perhaps, is something that might open up new areas and new vistas of research for our generation of scholars in the years to come. So on that note, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Noor, for that very enlightening and challenging lecture. Sige. So now we move on to our discussant. Yeah. So our discussant is an assistant professor at the Department of History here at UP Diliman. Assistant Professor Grace Lisa Concepcion teaches European history, Spanish colonial regime in the Philippines, especially the early modern period. And this semester, she's handling a graduate course on imperialism and colonialism. So let's hear from Dr. Grace Concepcion.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you very much, Professor Noor, for that lecture. First, when Professor Galang invited me here, I wondered why I was invited. But it was, yeah, I think I did something wrong and I have to confess. Anyway, okay, so thank you again for that thought-provoking lecture. It has raised questions that are relevant to us, Southeast students of history and other social sciences. I believe here we don't only have history majors listening, but they come from different fields. So yeah, so who also partake of the heritage of colonialism and imperialism. So I just want to point out some of the key points that you mentioned earlier. Well, first of all, you pointed out that the imperial origins of Southeast Asian studies, no, and how Southeast Asian studies were constructed through writing, and also you asked the audience why read texts written by colonial functionaries published centuries ago. What's the relevance of these texts to us now, present, and especially here? Here we are in the Philippines, because these writings, you said the writings, the structure of the texts have produced narratives that remain in the present. I like this point. Colonialism and imperialism were normalized and justified through language. Sometimes when we read those texts, we don't realize the power that those texts actually wield in constructing images that pervade even our imagination up to now. And when you said that empire requires normality, I said, I wonder what that means. And then I realized that, yeah, for imperialism to at least have an appearance of a semblance of stability, permanence, normality, there had to be routine in the running of empires, the management of colonies that was done not by conquerors, but by ordinary civil servants, bureaucrats, etc. And then, and I also thought of highlighting this because this is very, I think, very relevant to us, so also teachers of Philippine history, when you said that we can't look at history in an episodic way, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, because that's how we sort of neatly divide the periodization of, yeah, of yeah, yeah. So, yeah, because it's true that history is not neatly divided into periods. The first one informs the other. The past informs the present, and will likely inform the future. And when you said empires need to assuage its own conscience, I got reminded of Spanish colonialism that had perpetually needed to examine its conscience. And for instance, this examination resulted in the loss of the Indies, um, numerous decrees that we read, volumes of them, that claim to defend the rights of the natives, etc., and regularize the dynamics of imperialism. So I will not prolong this, but I told Professor Galang I was going to speak for 10 minutes only, but yeah, but I have actually I have more because I got more from the lecture. So anyway, you said that you contextualized these Western writings in the 19th century, when the Europeans were actually establishing, as they established their empires, um, they were also, I think, the dynamics in Europe, they were becoming divided into different independent autonomous nation states, right? So as they were actually coming to terms with their new identities as nations, and part of the construction of that identity was their adventures in Southeast Asia as well. So that's the context in Europe. And then, okay, so here, and then of course uh, you also more or less ended by asking, how does engagement with the 19th century texts benefit Southeast Asian studies? No, and well, engagement with these 19th century texts can show that the binaries east-west, north-south, native-foreign, subject, colonial, master can be problematized. And interrogating these writings can also show us how they framed the West and not just Southeast Asia. And finally, you challenged everybody as Southeast Asian scholars to engage globally. Okay, so now my questions. Since I have the microphone, I will enjoy the privilege of asking the first few questions. But maybe these are just fodder for discussion, no? That they can, you may or may not answer them here. But the title, 19th Century Writings as Confessional Texts, to me, the term confession evokes some relation with a wrongdoing, something very intimate that, if revealed, may cause humiliation. So I wonder if reading these texts against the grain, the reader can discern some kind of remorse or embarrassment that arises from the wrongs committed in the era of imperialism. I don't know. We'll see. And then also, the 19th century texts could be both read as literature and history. And as readers of today, how much freedom do we have to interpret these texts, considering that there is authorial presence? Would there be a difference in the treatment of these texts as literary and as historical texts? And then I'll limit my questions to three. I'll end with the third one, how would you assess the resurgence in the interest in empires now? Because I'm a 17th century researcher, and I've seen a growth of studies on the Iberian empires looking into the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Pacific as continuities. Yeah, and also using methodologies like microhistory to surface voices of subjects who were otherwise voiceless. So I'd like to ask, how do you see all those things? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start with your second question first, and you may not agree or be comfortable with the answer. Unfortunately, I fall under the category of those who don't really see a firm, clear, distinct boundary between history and literature in the first place. And that's because, like I said, I was polluted at birth thanks to doing philosophy and literature. So for me, everything's literature.
I understand.
But the point about authorial presence, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, right? There is and there isn't authorial presence. I mean, I can't read Raffles' History of Java as the menu for McDonald's. That would be absurd, right? But there are ways I can stretch the text. And I don't mean like, trying to twist the meanings or whatever. I look at things which have not come under the attention of other people who've read Raffles. For instance, most of the commentaries I've come across on Raffles' History of Java have been written by Western scholars, European scholars, albeit in the post-colonial period. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on our Western colleagues here, but the blatant, vile racism that we have in this book doesn't seem to have caught their attention, And so sometimes you read these academics, respectable academics who say, yes, Raffles made a few mistakes here and there. Yes, Raffles, was inaccurate in his historical dating. I mean, for heaven's sakes, the book is filled with, countless references, derogatory, racist references to the Javanese. And no Western scholar points this out, And I think, Mike, what? I mean, are you blind? Do you choose not to see this in front of you? And I think in that sense, I'm not stretching the limit. I'm just pointing out what's there, but that has not been pointed out by others before. And I think, like I said, the interesting thing about these books, is that these are colonial texts. You and I were never meant to read them, right? These authors never thought that the day would come where we would be educated enough, we can speak English, we can stand upright, and we can read books, right? And, they never expected that to happen. It's not like Jane Austen, I mean, and, of course, anyone can read Jane Austen, but Raffles never expected, the third world Southeast Asian to ever read his text, right? And when we do that, if we don't bring to that reading a Southeast Asian perspective, then what's the point? Like I said, I'm not a 19th century Englishman. I'm a 21st century third world academic. That's the only way I can read Raffles. I can only read Raffles as a 21st century third world academic. I can only read Jane Austen as a 21st century third world academic. And I don't apologize for that. So the authorial presence is there and duly noted, because for me, the authorial presence is loudest when I see and read Raffles calling the Javanese inferior and degenerate and backward and savages and a childlike race, that doesn't have scientific intellect. Oh, that's the author. Yeah. So in that sense, what's our job as the third world scholar, as third world scholars? If we don't bring our perspective to bear on these texts, we leave them and they remain hegemonic. So in that sense, then while for me, everything is narrative, right? Understanding the workings of these texts, because a narrative is being woven here, It is a story. It is a story about native backwardness and how native backwardness will be redeemed by Western secular modern intervention. That's a story, You know, it's not exactly Lord of the Rings, but it is a story, you know, and with heroes and villains and what have you. And I think we can actually read it critically, you know, except this time, you know, it's not the elves reading Lord of the Rings, it's the orcs reading Lord of the Rings. You know, they have a slightly different, you know, objection to Tolkien. And why not? Yeah. That enriches the text. And I think when we do that, I think that's something that we can contribute, right? The first question that you raised was
Yeah, confessional.
the confessional. Yes, well, okay, they're all very different. Raffles was, I think, the most egoistic and vain and of all, I think, but it's confessional in the sense that it's almost like a Freudian slip. It's like you confess to what you're actually doing. Now, of course, why were all these authors so keen to latch their narratives on some higher ideal, whether it's progress or science or civilization? I mean, that's what you are here for, to bring order, to bring law, to bring prosperity. It is an oblique confession in a sense that, you know, you're not meant to be there, for heaven's sakes. Yeah? You're not meant to occupy these lands. You're not meant to colonize these people. And so the need, therefore, to conjure science, progress, you know, becomes a sort of, in a Freudian sense, a kind of silent confession, you know. In very few of the authors, Warrener being the only American writer who actually says, you know, our conduct in Southeast Asia is shameful, you know, because he was a very Christian writer. And after what he saw, what the Americans did in Sumatra, this was the first American naval bombardment of Southeast Asia, by the way, which happens 70 years before the invasion of the Philippines. And he writes that, you know, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, yeah? But none of the rest ever admit to guilt. Some, in fact, you know, are proudly gleeful at their achievements. But in the midst of this, you know, trumpet-blowing triumphalism, there's always this need to conjure up some higher purpose. And this need to conjure up some higher purpose, for me at least, you know, suggests an implicit knowledge that, you're doing something wrong. And so you need to conjure up some noble ideal all the time. And I think that's, you know, that's a way that we can read them. If we begin to read them as confessional texts, then we begin to understand then why these constant exhortations to virtue, progress, modernity keep popping up, right? So in that sense, I suppose they're confessional. As for the interest in empire, do you mean contemporary political interest in empire? In scholarly interest. I think there's the scholarly interest in empire, but I also think it's coming from different, you know, sections of the world community for very different reasons, and in some cases not very pleasant reasons. You know, some recent works, good work, like in Turkey, for example, have looked at what seems to be this new trend of Ottoman revivalism, right? Which is, you know, let's celebrate the empire, but forget that we actually had colonies, you know, the sort of, you know, sanitized version of empire, which has clear, direct linkages with a very Ottoman form of ethno-nationalism that is, you know, on the rise and has been on the rise for more than 2 decades now. And so on the one hand, I think it's hard for me to give a precise answer to this question, because we see this interest in empire popping up in different parts of the world for different reasons, right? So I think in some cases, you know, it is actually symptomatic of actual ethno-nationalism on the rise. So the dusting of the cobwebs of empire, particularly in countries that used to be empires, like Ottoman Turkey, like Turkey, is for me interesting. Because remember, for a long time in Kemalist Turkey, in modern Turkey, the Ottoman past was completely erased. It was a matter of shame. It was even, you know, the state, the Kemalist state, you know, prevented people to from praising the Ottoman past because it was a reminder of their feudal days. But now we see this revivalism happening. And then, of course, in Europe and in some parts of the world, you have the revival of the interest in empire, but, coming from a decolonization perspective, a more critical understanding of empire. Where we are in Southeast Asia, what does worry me is that in different parts of Southeast Asia, and I take it that the debate in Philippines is very different from other neighboring countries, but there are some parts of Southeast Asia that are still in deep denial about empire, about the legacy of empire, and I think that's really partly to do with the fact that one bitter pill that I think all of us find hard to swallow is that our present day modern post-colonial Southeast Asia is a direct result of empire. Like I said, our map of Southeast Asia is a colonial map. You cannot escape that. I'm sorry, you can't. Our borders were not drawn by us. They were drawn in London and Paris and The Hague, and that's the reality. But a deeper and perhaps more disturbing fact that many of us find difficult to accept is that, and this is true of Southeast Asia as it is true of the rest of the post-colonial world, is that whether you like it or not, your post-colonial state is built on the foundations of colonies. Yeah, all post-colonial states are built on the foundations of colonies. And I think this is difficult for some societies to accept because it means, like we said earlier, there is no clear break between the colonial and the post-colonial, because there isn't a clear break between the post-colonial and the post-colonial. Basil Davidson's book, you might be familiar with, is very instructive. He has this wonderful book called, The Black Man's Burden, Africa and the Curse of the Nation State. And what Basil Davidson does in the book is that he says, the West constantly pathologizes Africa, Africa backward, savage, violent. But he said all the problems in Africa today are because of these stupid lines that you bureaucrats drew in Paris and The Hague and London, and you left these people with these completely artificial nation states that cut nations in half, cut communities in half, and now you expect them to live in peace? Whose fault is it? The fault is you. The legacy of empire is there. I think we in our part of the world need something like that moment of clarity where we wise up to the fact that, whether we like it or not, we are all children of empire as well. And that doesn't mean that we are doomed for life. It's not like a cursed poisonous DNA, we're all going to turn into vampires or whatever. But it just means that it's part and parcel of who we are, and we need an honest reckoning with that. But I think the problem with our part of the world is immediately after decolonization, like I said, we were swept in the wave of nationalist fervor. We wrote our national histories, and we immediately captured the state as our new prize. We forgot to check, look under the prize, is it made in empire? That's the problem. We forgot to check. We just took the prize, and now we are stuck with it, And this prize has got problems built into it. Because remember one thing: no colony is a democracy. All colonies are police states, and that's what we inherited. And then from there, we are supposed to build modern, progressive, liberal nation states. Well, good luck, because the machine that we got has already built in, defaults programmed into it. And because I think that moment of thoughtful critique never happened, we are still encumbered with these problems.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Grabe yung mga tanong ni Ma'am Grace. No? Very sharp questions, no? But very enlightening, the answers of Professor Noor. We can accommodate 2 or 3 questions, no, before we... There's one here, and then there's one here from Professor Wani Obias. Sige, please state your name and your affiliation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Farish. I am Mark Lester Racelis, a bachelor degree of public administration and member of Project Saysay, a history organization. So since you tackle about uh, empire requires normalization as fast as possible and do a passage in uh, Americans that they think they are Western, but not they are one of the other Westerns. Um, since there's a geopolitical issues and challenges between China and America, do you think American frequently and slowly imperializing or hegemonizing the Southeast Asian nation by uh, using their influence to the region to use Southeast Asia as an outside wall in the Pacific to protect their wealth and power?
Okay, before Professor Noor answers that, can we hear? Meron pa ba? Okay na ba yun? Oh, sorry,
Ah,
sorry.
Yes, I do have two questions.
Okay, so the
but
first one is
yes.
about how the United States views Southeast Asia in relation to its relationship with China
Yeah.
at the during in the contemporary period.
Yes.
Okay, so what's the second one?
The second one is, did America think themselves as a savior or a superhero who saved the third world countries and used to imperialize or hegemonize the other countries
That's during the 19th century, you mean?
in the current situation?
Current situation. Okay. Sige. So, since before that, Professor Noor, please si Ma'am Roda muna. Sige. Para
Okay, Dr. Noor, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk. I found it very interesting. I do work in 19th century. I particularly like doing work on propaganda and narratives. So I do history of emotion. So I do realize how important narratives are. And so my questions really, I have 3 points to make. 2 questions, 2 very quick questions, and one point I'd just like to share. The first question has to do with the narratives itself. Have you found any conflicting narratives amongst, let's say, just the British or just the Dutch? I mean, the way that you presented it, it seemed as though they have one hegemonic narrative, but I'm curious whether you've seen any conflicting narratives. Second question is, you do raise a point that in the 17th century, because of capitalistic motives, there was this need to create narratives that would normalize colonialism. So my question is, what was it before the 17th century? So I don't know if this is like beyond your scope, but what was different before the 17th century? What types of narratives, if ever, did they have? What motivations did they have before the 17th century? Last point is that I find it interesting that in the 19th century, Filipino nationalists were already conversing with the colonizers in their texts. So if you look at Rizal's works, for example, there was this constant negotiation, contesting the narratives of the colonizers. A more recent study even looked at how Filipino nationalists used German accounts to, to scare away Spanish colonizers. I just find that the intersections can be more nuanced if you do look at the natives' way of contesting such narratives. So that's it. I guess after this we can discuss more. So I'll just keep it very brief.
so the first question, the first set of questions is about the United States, and the second one is on narratives.
I think as to the question about America today, the best person who can answer that is Trump. And I think, I mean, the next 5 years, your question will be answered, right? But I just want to say one thing. This thing, and talking about narratives and how narratives, we swim in narratives all the time. I'm interested in one aspect of this so-called America-China rivalry. Now, if you follow the international news, you may notice that often there's one phrase that gets used again and again. I'm really tired of this phrase. They use this phrase, Cold War 2.0. Remember that? Yeah? Cold War 2.0. I don't know whether this is to sell newspapers or to sell TV rights or whatever, but this is a phrase that's used all the time. Cold War 2.0. Now, So I know I'm getting old, I'm close to retirement, but in case, my mind or my brain cells are still working, if I'm not mistaken, the Cold War involved an actual ideological contestation, right? Between two very different ideologies. If you look at what's happening now, notably between, all right, okay. So if you look at what's happening now, although ostensibly China is supposed to be a communist country, in terms of its actual economic praxis internationally, it's a capitalist country. Yeah, it's a capitalist country. So for me, you really have a competition between two rival capitalist powers. Now, when was the last time Southeast Asia experienced a competition between rival capitalist powers? It was the 19th century. Yeah, because Holland, Spain, England, ideologically were the same. They were all here to make money. Yeah. So for me, it's not Cold War 2.0, it's Empire 2.0. Now, that's what we are seeing now. And I just wish sometimes, people, historians would like, just interject a bit and get people to get the vocabulary right. So as to, how America sees, remember, America comes into the picture late. And don't forget, America's emergence as a new power in this part of the world coincides with the rise of another new power, Japan. And we see something very interesting happening, yeah? From the mid-19th century, there seems to be a tacit, implicit understanding. Japan gets mainland Asia. So Japan, you can move into Manchuria, China, but the Pacific is America. So America gets Hawaii, Guam, and eventually Philippines. So that has been how, this whole concert between these rival competing powers are. And I think we're still witnessing the same today, which is why I think it's so important for us in our part of the world, because, we are the stage where this drama gets played. We're the stage. So we need to sometimes revisit our own history and remind ourselves that, none of what we are seeing now is new. Right? None of what we are seeing now is new. Yeah. But I honestly cannot answer the second part of your question, because, what's, whether America is using this as hegemony. It's, for me, it's like the McDonald's question, is McDonald's selling American hegemony? McDonald's is selling McDonald's, it's selling burgers. It just so happens that these burgers come from a country that is hegemonic. So by extension, it becomes hegemonic. But a burger is just a bad burger. That's all. It's nothing more than that. So that's as far as I can go. Your third point earlier is interesting, because, and then here is where we see very real differences between the experiences of colonialism in Southeast Asia. Because see, the one thing about the Philippines is that because the Spanish presence here was longer, and because Spain really wanted to create an extension of Spain. It was a colony, not the kind of British bureaucratic colony, but a colony to relocate its people here. And then you have things like literacy, yeah, and with that literacy comes this reading public and the idea of a public of letters, yeah, which you don't get in other parts of colonial Southeast Asia. You don't have that, right? The Dutch, for instance, made it a point. Don't teach Dutch, yeah, because we don't want them to understand our way of running things. So we don't teach them our language. We learn their language, but we don't teach them our language. So that in itself is very interesting. The British system is one where English becomes hegemonized. It becomes the language of administration. But British colonization is different because British colonials were basically bureaucratic functionaries. So you go to India for 5 years, and then we post you to Burma for 3 years. And after that, you go back to England. You settle, you go back to England, you retire in Tunbridge, Wales, or wherever, but you don't settle in Malaya. You don't have a family. That's why when the British Empire ended, right? I mean, there wasn't a war between, Indians and British settlers, or Pakistanis and British settlers, or Malayans and British settlers, because they all packed and left already. Yeah, they came, make their money, went back home and collected their retirement. It's very different. So we have actually very different types of empire, and that creates very different reading publics. That's why I think the case of the Philippines is different. Yeah. Now, the earlier point, then, sorry, the first and second questions, can you?
It's on the differences on whether you've seen conflicting
Ah,
narratives.
yes. Okay. Yes, there are conflicting narratives, of course, between empires, within empires. One thing I found among the British, yeah, was that there were different types of conflicts, but one interesting one was between two types of advocates of empire, and I call these minimalist imperialists and maximalist imperialists. Yeah. So you have minimalist imperialists like John Crawford, who basically said, yeah, we want all of Southeast Asia, but let's just take the islands. Let's just take Penang and then Singapore and then Labuan, because we want these colonies like battleships. We have a string of pearls, you know. But the hinterland, we leave it to all these natives. You know, there they can eat each other, kill themselves. We don't care. You know, as long as we keep buying their rubber and tin and all that, let them do whatever they want. Don't interfere in their affairs, because we are not here to educate them.
Yeah.
We don't care about them. We want their goods. We want their commodities. So what they do to themselves, let them do it. You know. So you have that school, the minimalist school, and then you have the Raffles, you know, and the Mundis and the Kipples, and these are the maximalists. And for Raffles, his biggest disappointment was when Britain gave back Java to the Dutch, because for him this was the jewel in the crown. Yeah. Yes, for him, Java was the prize of the whole of Southeast Asia. Java was the thing that Britain must never give up, because, and so that you have, and these disputes are actually very interesting, because again, like I said earlier, it's so interesting that Western scholars who've written about this period don't seem to pick this up. And maybe it's because we were on the receiving end of all this. I think, as you know, the descendants of colonial subjects, we get a bit sensitive. We begin to see designs which perhaps others don't see. And then, of course, you know, so these disputes do exist. Yeah?
Yeah.
Like I said, between
Yes.
the writers of empires
And
and
then
between
within,
empires as well. Yeah. Both the British and the Dutch were intense economic rivals, and Britain, of course, is pushing the neoliberal, you know, very similar to today's free market laissez-faire economics, whereas the Dutch system is more monopolistic, you know, cartel-like. So these are, again, two examples, two very different models of capital at work. And so an economic historian writing a history of Southeast Asia would be able to write something very interesting, that actually Southeast Asia became a battleground for different economic experiments, you know, different kinds of capitalism. There's not one hegemonic capitalism, there are different kinds of capitalism all competing at the same time. Yeah. And
the last was on pre-17th century narratives, if it's still within your scope.
No, I mean, no, the reason why I focus on the 17th, because for me, of course, you know, it's still open to dispute, right? When does modernity with a capital M begin? Some would argue that it starts with, you know, the 17th century, because the two important things happen. Yeah, we have Westphalia, and before Westphalia, we have colonial capitalism, because that's when the East India Company, the Dutch East Indies Company, this marks an important turning point in global history, because for the first time, capital is now unfettered. Yeah, it's not the prerogative of the king. The citizen now becomes, you know, his own power. You can pool capital, and a company can be richer than the king. That's an enormous leap that has never happened, right? That impacts then on the rest of the world. Now, prior to that, of course, all empires, even the Romans, you know, had, you know, Pax Roma, what have you. But from the beginnings of early modernity, and especially up to the 19th century, I think what we see is increasingly, you know, these vocabularies being marshaled into play. So the scientific progress, modernity, development, and then later, especially among the Americans, the rise of scientific racism, right? I mean, theory of racial difference, which becomes the basis of the justification of slavery in America, but also the justification for American imperial adventures abroad, because I mean, this is taught in Harvard, which becomes the center that teaches racial difference. In America, this becomes official, officially sanctioned or accepted, intellectual property among the political elite. And of course, if science can justify slavery, science can also justify empire, right? So I think this is what we begin to see. It's what I find interesting is that as the 19th century progresses, empire has more and more things it can pick from. It's spoiled for choice, because it's no longer just because we are good, but no, it's because we are more modern than you. We are ahead of time. We are more developed. We understand law. You don't understand law. So law, order, stability, progress, development, wealth, all of these things get marshaled in. And it's amazing how empire is like the sponge that just absorbs, anything for it to keep that narrative going. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we can still accommodate one last question. Anyone from the audience? Okay, see Jerome. Jerome is a PhD student.
Hello. In a nutshell, I would like to ask, how does the reading of these colonial writings or texts challenge the prevailing colonial historiography of Southeast Asia?
It depends on, again, are you talking about colonial historiography by Southeast Asians, or colonial historiography on Southeast Asia that emanates from outside Southeast Asia? I mean, sadly, what's happened over the last few decades is a rehabilitation of empire. And this is very true in the case of Britain. This is one of the reasons why the whole decolonization wave in England has caused so much controversy, because there's been a reaction in Britain when people were saying, of course, empire wasn't all that bad. I mean, after all, look what we did. We made Singapore, right? I mean, so you have that kind of reaction going on in there. But by that you mean what's going on here in our part of the world? Well, this is the thing. We don't have a common or consistent, narrative about empire and how we talk about empire and how we understand empire. Some countries in Southeast Asia remain largely in denial. Yeah, there are still many parts of Southeast Asia and the many sections of society in Southeast Asia who have no problems whatsoever, with embracing empire, because after all, empire brought wealth. It opened up opportunities for business. I mean, in many parts of Southeast Asia, and this is where, your class subject position becomes very clear. It's not a coincidence, yeah, that, there are places, hotels, named after Raffles. Yeah? You have like Raffles Hospital and Raffles Hotel and all that. I mean, that for me, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm not exaggerating. That for me is like calling it like Hitler Hotel or Hitler Hospital. But for some people, that's fine, because he's a good guy, right? I mean, the guy, built Singapore and, brought prosperity and progress. So that's our debate. We don't have a debate. That's the problem. Yeah. We don't have a serious critical debate. In many parts of Southeast Asia, empire is either an embarrassment, that it becomes a source of national shame. And so you can only talk about it in like negative terms, like empire is bad, everything about empire is bad, and they're all bad. All these foreigners are bad, which, by the way, is also untrue, because remember, empires also require collaboration. Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that really upsets me when I look at the ways in which colonial history is discussed in some parts of Southeast Asia is this tendency for this discourse to be taken up, particularly by conservative political groupings, to present this very simple dialectic that everything Asian is good and everything Western is bad. Now, don't forget that all these Western empires could only survive for so long because they had local support. Yeah, it's like, you know, if you go to India, all these patriotic movies, you know, all the British are very bad, you know, and all that. But you know, the British colonial army in India, most of the soldiers were Indians. If you look at the Dutch colonial army in Holland, in Indonesia, the KNIL, Colonial Netherlands Indische Leger, most of the soldiers are actually Ambonese and Maduris. They're Indonesians, yeah, they're hired. So that's another painful, difficult aspect of empire we have to deal with. And why is this important? It's important because today, the entanglement of the third world, of the developing countries, in an unfair international economic order is also because of collaboration. It's because of local compradors who collaborate with this and sell out their countries to global capital. You know, so for me, there is no, you know, neat break from empire to post-empire, colony to post-colony. It's still there. So yeah, I'm sorry. I think that's where we are now. I wish we could have a more consistent, a more critical, a more in-depth debate, but I don't think we have one. Even in Malaysia, where I come from, yeah, the state of debate, at best, it's all British are bad. That's it. You know, I mean, the hit movie that came out a few years ago, I think presented a somewhat distorted, you know, account of British colonialism in Malaysia, because it was one of these like hit patriotic, you know, movies set during the era of empire. And again, it repeats all these tropes. You know, we are the good victims and they're all the bad guys. But it forgets again that, you know, empire could sustain itself for so long because it found ways to get collaboration from the natives themselves. And this is something that I think has always been problematic for many post-colonial societies to deal with. All right.
Okay, thank you, Professor Noor. So this ends our lecture. Thank you so much for your active participation. What I like most in the presentation was the challenge given to us, I mean, historians and social scientists. What's our responsibility in understanding the past, especially in reading the materials that the colonizers have left us? No? So we in history, for instance, have this tendency to highlight in our classes, like, how do we read the text? We have to put ourselves in the shoes of the author. What was happening, for instance, during his time. But this lecture highlighted the need for us to, maybe we should reread the text, not in the context of the author, but in our own context. So I think that's very powerful. Naiyak. Okay, so maraming salamat sa lahat. Of course, thank you very much, Dr. Grace Concepcion, for those very sharp insights and questions, and of course, our lecturer this afternoon, Professor Farish Noor. We hope that we could invite you again in our other lectures in the future. Maraming salamat. A round of applause for our lectures. Thank you so much.
Meron po yung ibang line. Nagpa-request po kami.